On their wedding night, he tore off her sleeve, not out of lust, but because he wanted to see her tremble. But what he saw in the dim light wasn't tears, it was scars. Dozens of scars etched into her flesh like the signatures of a crime even the most fearsome New York mob boss hadn't dared name. In an instant, everything he believed in, about his dead brother, about this marriage, about himself, collapsed completely. If you're reading this story, please like and comment with the name of the city you're in. I want to know how far my story has come. And don't turn off the screen, because this is just the beginning. The rain came down hard the night Evelina Moretti became a Vescari. It hit the tall windows of the estate chapel in sheets, not the soft kind of rain that makes people think of nostalgia or new beginnings, but the punishing kind, cold, relentless, indifferent to whoever it fell on. Inside, 400 guests filled lacquered mahogany pews. Captains, consiglieri, politicians with soft hands and hard eyes, women draped in silk, who knew exactly what kind of room they were sitting in and had learned long ago to smile through it. The flowers were white. The candles were real wax. The music was live, a string quartet imported from somewhere in Europe that no one was actually listening to. At the front of the room, Damien Vescari stood beside the priest with both hands clasped behind his back and his jaw locked tight enough to crack a molar. He was 34. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, wearing a black suit that had cost more than most people in this city earned in a month. His face was the kind of face that had been described in federal reports as expressionless under questioning, which was a polite way of saying he had trained himself, starting from somewhere around age 12, never to let anything that was happening inside him reach the surface. He didn't look at the doors when they opened. He didn't need to. He already knew what was walking toward him. Evelina Moretti came down the aisle alone. No father figure to escort her. The man who had raised her, a retired dock worker named Peter Moretti, a quiet, sun-worn man in a borrowed suit, sat 3 rows back with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on the floor, either from grief or from shame or from the specific kind of helplessness that comes from watching someone you love walk into something you couldn't stop. She wore ivory, long sleeves. Her dark hair was pinned up off her neck, and her expression, from a distance, might have looked serene, composed, the kind of stillness that reads as elegance in photographs. Up close, it was something else entirely. Her jaw was set the way a person sets their jaw when they're preparing for an injection they know is going to hurt. Her breathing was measured, deliberate, the slow, controlled rhythm of someone who had taught themselves not to show panic in rooms full of dangerous people. Her hands held a small bouquet of white flowers that trembled slightly. Not much, just enough for someone paying close attention to notice. Damien noticed. He filed it away without expression. The ceremony lasted 22 minutes. The priest spoke. The appropriate words were said by both parties. Damien's voice when he repeated the vows was flat and precise, the same voice he used when giving orders to men who understood that the instruction would not be repeated. Evelina's voice was quieter but steady, and she looked him in the eye when she said the words, which surprised him. He had expected her to look away. She didn't. She looked directly at him, not defiantly, not with hatred, with something else he couldn't immediately categorize. Then the ring was on her finger, the guests applauded, and the deed was done. The reception moved to the main hall of the Vescari estate, a room with 30-foot ceilings and walls hung with paintings that had been accumulating for 3 generations. The food was extraordinary and barely touched. The bar was excellent and heavily used. The guests circulated in the particular way of people who are simultaneously celebrating and being careful, reading the room, watching Damien, trying to understand what this marriage meant for the distribution of power, the arrangement of alliances, the calculus of who owed what to whom. Damien circulated too. He shook hands and accepted congratulations with his face arranged into a version of pleasantness that fooled most people. The ones who knew him well enough, his head of security, 2 of his senior captains, recognized the slight tightness around his eyes that meant he was calculating something. He left Evelina alone at a table in the east corner of the room within 40 minutes of the reception starting. Not accidentally. The table had been positioned deliberately near a cluster of lower-ranking men who had reputations for cruelty and loose mouths. Men who would see a young woman sitting alone at her own wedding reception and feel invited to comment on it. Damien wanted to watch how she handled it, wanted to see if she crumbled, deflected, flirted, pleaded. He wanted to understand her. He watched from across the room while pretending to listen to his uncle Vittorio discuss the coming month's shipping schedules. Vittorio Vescari was 61, silver-haired, heavy-set, with the kind of face that photographs well and the kind of eyes that didn't. He had served as the family's operational second for over 20 years, stepping into the vacancy left by Damien's father's death with a smoothness that had always struck Damien, in retrospect, as slightly too practiced. At the time, grief had made Damien grateful for the steadiness. Now, standing beside the man in a room full of his people, Damien felt the customary faint unease he'd learned to suppress. "She's pretty enough," Vittorio said, nodding toward Evelina without looking directly at her. "Quiet. Good quality in a wife." "You're not here to evaluate my wife," Damien said. Vittorio smiled. "Of course not." Across the room, two of the men at Evelina's table were leaning toward her with the loose-shouldered posture of people who thought they were being charming. One said something that made the other laugh. Damien couldn't hear it. He watched Evelina's face carefully from 60 feet away. She didn't flinch, didn't smile to appease them. Looked at the man who'd spoken with a calm, flat regard that lasted just long enough to be unsettling, then turned her eyes back to the glass of water in front of her. The man leaned back slightly. Damien noticed that too. Later in the evening, during the part of the reception where he was required to stand beside Evelina while various captains and their wives offered formal congratulations, he watched her up close. She stood straight, responded to introductions with appropriate minimal courtesy. When one of the wives, a sharp-featured woman named Carla, whose husband ran the docks, made a remark under her breath about the charity bride finally getting her piece, Evelina turned toward her and said very quietly and very clearly, "Excuse me?" in a tone that made Carla look elsewhere immediately. Damien had not expected that either. He leaned toward Evelina's ear. "You'd do well to make friends in this room." She turned her head slightly without looking at him. "I do better to know who my enemies are first." He had nothing to say to that. 2 hours into the reception, he brought her a glass of champagne she hadn't asked for and set it in front of her without comment. She didn't touch it. He watched her for a moment, the careful way she held her spine, the way her fingers never fully relaxed, the way she tracked the room's movement without appearing to, and felt a flicker of something that was not the contempt he had been cultivating for 3 years. He shut it down immediately. He reminded himself why he had built this. 3 years ago, Luca Vescari had been 26 and brilliant and stupid in the specific way that young men with good hearts are stupid. He trusted the wrong things, felt the wrong loyalties, believed the world was smaller than it was. He had gone dark on Damien for 4 months, stopped answering calls, missed family meetings. When Damien finally sent men to find him, Luca had been living in a rented room in Williamsburg under a false name, conducting what looked from the outside like an obsessive romance with a woman no one could identify. The investigation afterward turned up almost nothing. One item: a silver pendant, small and oval, engraved with a rose crest so fine it had to have been made by hand, found on the floor beside Luca's body after the car bomb detonated in a parking structure off the BQE. Damien had stared at that pendant for a long time. Then, 6 weeks later, he had seen it again. Hanging from the neck of a 23-year-old woman named Evelina Moretti, who worked reception at a mid-level law firm in Midtown, who had grown up in Red Hook with a dock worker father and no mother on record, who had no apparent connection to organized crime and no criminal history and no reason at all to be wearing a pendant identical to the one found at his brother's death scene. He had arranged the marriage himself. He had fabricated a business alliance between the Vescari interests and the ghost of a defunct Italian family name that Evelina carried without knowing its weight. He had presented it to the relevant parties as strategy, as legacy, as the kind of move that powerful men make to consolidate position. The real reason lived in the cold room in the back of his chest where he kept the things he didn't allow himself to examine. She had ruined Luca somehow, distracted him, broken his attention, drawn him off course into something that got him killed. And Damien intended to understand exactly how and why by watching her live inside his world until the answer surfaced. He had not anticipated that she would be difficult to read. He had not anticipated that she would carry herself with the specific, bone-deep composure of someone who had been through things far worse than a cold husband and a hostile room. He caught himself watching her a third time before the night was half over and made a conscious, deliberate decision to stop doing it. The reception ended after midnight. Guests moved to their cars with the careful efficiency of people who knew not to linger too long inside the Viscari estate. Vittorio embraced Damien at the door, clasped both his shoulders, said something about family and the future with that warm, even smile of his. Damien thanked him and felt nothing. The estate emptied. The penthouse above Manhattan waited. The elevator ride up was silent. 43 floors. Evelina stood with her back slightly toward the mirrored wall and her bouquet still in her hands, which struck Damien as strange. Most women would have set it down by now, or left it behind entirely. She was still holding it like a prop she hadn't figured out how to discard. He said nothing during the ride. She said nothing either. The penthouse was large and expensive and cold in the specific way that spaces feel when they've been designed for impression rather than for living. Floor-to-ceiling glass along the south wall showing Manhattan blazing beneath the rain. Minimal furniture, dark wood, a color palette that was tasteful and entirely without warmth. Damien had lived here for 6 years and owned almost nothing in it with sentimental value. He loosened his jacket and went to the bar. He heard her footsteps move toward the windows. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon and did not offer her any and turned around. She was standing at the glass wall, still in the wedding dress, one hand flat against the surface, looking down at the city. The lights of Manhattan reflected up against the cloud cover, orange and white and restless, the particular insomnia of a city that had never learned to stop. Below them, 43 floors down, traffic moved in the rain. "You can stop pretending now," Damien said. There's no audience left." She didn't turn immediately. Let a beat pass. Not from hesitation, but from something more deliberate, like she was deciding whether the conversation was worth engaging. Then she turned. "What exactly do you think I'm pretending to be?" He studied her face. In the low light of the penthouse, she looked different than she had in the chapel, different than she had during the reception. The performance of composure had settled into something that was simply how she looked when no one was demanding anything from her. She was still beautiful. It was an inconvenient detail that he had been ignoring for months and would continue to ignore. "I know who you are," he said. "You don't." "I know what you did to my brother." Something passed across her face then. Not guilt, not fear, not defiance. He couldn't name it in the moment. It moved through her expression and was gone before he could hold it still long enough to read. "Luca," she said quietly, almost to herself. The word came out shaped differently than names usually do when people say them. It came out shaped like something painful, something she kept in a particular place. The sound of it hit Damien in the sternum. He crossed the room. He wasn't thinking clearly. The bourbon was only his second drink of the night, and he was not a man who lost himself in alcohol, but the sound of his brother's name in her mouth had bypassed whatever careful architecture he usually maintained between his intentions and his actions. He grabbed her wrist, not violently, but with a force that left no question about his intention, pulling her toward him, and the movement shifted the fabric of her sleeve. Long sleeves, even in June, which he had registered and dismissed earlier, and pulled it down off her shoulder. He stopped. The room stopped. He looked at what was there on her skin. Thin, pale scars. Not random, not accidental. They ran in deliberate patterns across her upper arm and over her shoulder, some old enough to have faded to near white against her olive skin, others less old, all of them unmistakably intentional. The kind of marks that required proximity and time and deliberate application of something sharp or burning. The kind of marks that don't happen once. His grip on her wrist went slack. She stepped backward and pulled the fabric back over her shoulder in one practiced motion. The speed of it told him she'd done this before. The covering, the concealment. And she was watching him now with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite shame, but contained both of them along with something harder underneath. The rain kept hitting the glass. Damien stood very still. He had seen men marked in his world. Injuries, punishment, the occasional branding that certain crews used in certain contexts. He knew what deliberate scarring looked like when someone inflicted it on another person. He knew the difference between marks left in violence and marks left in something more systematic and sustained. These were the second kind. "Who did that to you?" he said. It wasn't a question exactly. It came out flat and low, the tone he used when he had already decided something and was waiting for a detail to attach it to. She said nothing. His jaw tightened. "Who?" Still nothing. She looked at him steadily and said nothing, and he understood in that moment that her silence was not the silence of someone protecting an abuser out of misplaced loyalty. It was the silence of someone who had learned, probably early and probably through experience, that saying the name of the person who hurt you didn't make you safer. It sometimes made you less safe. That realization landed somewhere in him and didn't move. He turned away from her and set his glass down on the bar counter with careful, controlled precision. He stood with his back to the room for a moment. Behind him, he heard her move toward the bedroom. He didn't stop her. He stood at the bar for a long time in the dark of the penthouse with the city glowing below him, turning over the architecture of his own certainty and finding it badly constructed. She had said Luca's name like someone who grieved him. He had spent 3 years building a case against a woman he had never spoken to, never investigated, never gave a moment of fairness to, because a pennant had matched and his grief had needed somewhere to live. He thought about the long sleeves, the way she held her body in a crowd, the particular vigilance she maintained. Not paranoia, not performance, but the deep-grained alertness of someone who had spent years scanning rooms for exits and threats. None of that belonged to a predator. He poured the rest of his bourbon into the sink. Then he went to his desk and called the private investigator he kept on retainer for sensitive matters, a former federal analyst named Crane who asked no questions and delivered results, and gave him a name. "Everything you can find," Damien said. "Before she was Moretti, before Red Hook, all of it." Crane asked what the time frame was. "Yesterday," Damien said, and ended the call. He sat in the dark office adjacent to the bedroom, the door half open, and listened to the rain against the glass and to the faint sound of Evelina's breathing from the other room as she finally fell asleep, and he tried to remember the last time he had been this wrong about something this important. He couldn't. By the time the city's darkness began diluting toward gray, Crane had sent the first of what would turn out to be a series of files that Damien would open on his encrypted laptop with his hand around a cold coffee cup and his face arranged into its default expression, while something cold and awful moved through his chest like floodwater looking for cracks. The first file opened with a single line: "No verifiable identity prior to age 13. Evelina Moretti does not exist before 2007. Damien read it twice. Then he kept reading. And by the time the city was fully light outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, and the rain had finally stopped, and Evelina was still asleep in the bedroom behind the half-open door, he understood for the first time exactly who he had married. And he understood, with a coldness that settled into his bones and didn't lift, exactly what that meant about who had arranged this marriage, and why. He looked at the closed bedroom door for a long moment. Then he looked at his phone. Then at Vittorio's contact name on the screen. He did not call, not yet. Instead, he closed the laptop, stood, and moved silently to the bedroom doorway. He stood there and looked at her. Sleeping on the far edge of the bed, still in part of the dress, curled slightly inward, her shoulder covered. Her face in sleep was younger than it was awake. Whatever vigilance kept her upright and guarded during waking hours had finally let go. And what was underneath it was a person who looked exhausted at a level that didn't come from one bad night. Damien stood in the doorway for a long time. He thought about his brother, 26 years old, in a rented room in Williamsburg, conducting what Damien had interpreted as an obsessive, reckless romance. He thought about what it might look like instead if a young man had found someone in terrible danger and decided, without telling anyone who might stop him, to do something about it. Outside the penthouse windows, Manhattan was waking up gray and wet under clearing clouds, and somewhere in the city the people responsible for the marks on Evelina Moretti's skin were still breathing, still operating, still certain they had arranged things exactly the way they wanted them. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet. Crane delivered the second file at 7:43 in the morning. Damien was still at his desk. He hadn't slept. The coffee in his cup had gone cold an hour ago, and he hadn't refilled it because moving felt like an interruption he couldn't afford. The laptop screen threw pale light across his face in the gray morning, and he read with the particular stillness of a man absorbing information that is reorganizing something fundamental inside him. The file was 41 pages. It took him 90 minutes to get through it once. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again more slowly, stopping at certain pages, certain photographs, certain names that appeared in documents he recognized, and some he didn't. By the time he heard movement from the bedroom, the quiet, careful sounds of someone waking in an unfamiliar space and taking a moment to remember where they were, he had closed the laptop and was sitting with both hands flat on the desk surface, staring at the middle distance, doing something he almost never permitted himself to do. He was sitting with being wrong. Not wrong the way a man is wrong about a business decision or a tactical calculation. Wrong the way a man is wrong when he has spent 3 years building a monument to his own grief and called it justice. Wrong the way a man is wrong when the story he needed to believe turned out to be a story he invented, piece by carefully selected piece, because the alternative, that his brother died alone trying to do something good and nobody helped him, was a grief too large to hold without something to aim it at. He had aimed it at her. The bedroom door opened. Evelina came out wearing the clothes she'd apparently found in the closet, a plain dark shirt, trousers, nothing of her wedding dress remaining. Her hair was down, her face was clean. She looked like she had washed away the previous night with methodical efficiency, the way someone does who has a lot of practice resetting themselves after difficult events and has learned not to waste time on the transition. She saw him at the desk and stopped walking. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The morning light was flat and gray through the penthouse windows. Manhattan below was fully awake now, sirens somewhere distant, the constant low frequency of a city in motion. "There's coffee," Damien said. "Kitchen." She looked at him for another second. Assessing something, he could see it in her eyes, the quick calibration of a person deciding how much a given environment has shifted overnight. And then she walked to the kitchen without comment. He heard the sound of her pouring a cup. He heard her stop. Then she came back to the doorway of the kitchen and held her cup and looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." "Why not?" It wasn't asked with sympathy. It was asked the way a person asks when they want a factual answer rather than a social one. He looked at her across the room. "I made some calls last night." Her hand tightened slightly on the cup, almost imperceptible. He caught it. "About me," she said. "Yes." She came into the room and sat down in the chair across from his desk, which surprised him. He had expected her to stay near the door, to keep distance, to do what people who feel cornered usually do. Instead, she sat down and held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at him steadily. "What did you find?" she said. "Enough to know that I've been operating on a story that wasn't true." Something shifted in her jaw. Not relief. More complicated than relief. The specific expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment for a long time, and now that it's arrived, doesn't feel the way they expected it to feel. "Luca never told you," she said. "No." "He said he would." She looked down at her cup. "He said he was going to come to you, that you were the only one he trusted with it." A pause. And then he was gone. The room was very quiet. Damien's hands were still flat on the desk surface. He was aware of his own breathing, controlled, deliberate, the long practiced rhythm of a man who had decided years ago that visible emotion was a liability. He felt that discipline getting tested in a way it rarely was. "Tell me what he knew," he said. Her eyes came back up to his. "Not yet." His jaw tightened. "Evelina, you married me to punish me." Her voice was level, not accusatory, not emotional, and just factual, the way someone states a thing they have confirmed and no longer need to argue about. "You spent last night reading a file and now you want information. That's not a conversation. That's an interrogation with better furniture." He held her gaze. She held it back. "What do you want?" he said finally. I want to know that when I tell you what I know, you don't decide it's easier to make me disappear than to deal with what I'm going to tell you. A beat. That's not a dramatic question. It's a practical one. Damien looked at her for a long time. You're still here, he said. That's your answer. She considered it. Then she nodded once, slowly, like she was filing it away under provisional trust rather than genuine confidence. He understood the distinction. He respected it. Not today, she said. I need to think about how much you're ready to hear. She got up, took her coffee, and went back toward the bedroom. At the doorway, she stopped. The pendant, she said, without turning around. It was Luca's. He gave it to me for safekeeping the last time I saw him. He said if anything happened to him, the crest would explain everything to the right people. A pause. He said you would recognize it. She went into the bedroom and closed the door quietly behind her. Damien sat very still. Then he opened his laptop and called Crane back. Vasem. The next 4 days were a specific kind of warfare that left no visible marks. On the surface, the Viscari penthouse settled into a functional and entirely cold arrangement. Evelina moved through the space with contained efficiency, established her own routines. Early mornings, black coffee, books she had apparently packed in a single bag she'd brought to the wedding as if she'd known better than to ship anything ahead. She ate, she slept, she avoided the parts of the penthouse where Damien conducted business, which was a perimeter she seemed to understand instinctively without being told. Damien ran his operations during the day, attended to the Empire's ongoing maintenance, fielded calls from captains and lawyers and the various political figures who needed periodic management. He did all of it with the surface efficiency that people around him had always relied on. His underboss, a thick-necked, careful man named Sal, noticed nothing different. His head of security noticed nothing different. Vittorio called twice. Damien answered both times. Spoke normally. Gave nothing away. He was very good at giving nothing away. What he was doing underneath the surface, through Crane and 2 other investigators he'd activated from separate channels, was tearing apart 20 years of history looking for the seams where the story had been stitched together wrong. On the 3rd day, Evelina came to find him. He was in the study. It was after 11 at night, and he had a glass of bourbon that had been sitting at the same level for 40 minutes. She knocked on the open door frame, and he looked up. She came in and sat down across from him. Same chair as before. Same held coffee cup, though it was clearly not coffee at this hour. Your uncle called the penthouse line today, she said. Damien's expression didn't move. What did he say? He asked if I was settling in, very warm, very avuncular. Her voice was dry and flat. He mentioned that family dinners are a weekly tradition and that he looks forward to getting to know me better. She paused. He also mentioned very casually that the east wing of the estate has been renovated recently and that there are lovely new rooms if I ever wanted more space. Damien set down his glass. The east wing of the Viscari estate was where Vittorio conducted meetings he didn't want recorded. He's trying to find out how much you know, Damien said. He's trying to find out how much you've told me. She looked at him steadily. Those are different questions. He's not afraid of what I know. He's afraid of what you might have shared with me. He's measuring whether you trust me yet. Damien looked at her. She was right. The precision of her read on it annoyed him the way accurate things sometimes do when you've just arrived at the same conclusion yourself and would have preferred to be the first one there. How do you know what the East Wing is? He said. Luca told me things about this family. She met his eyes without apology. He told me a lot of things. The room held the weight of that. Tell me one of them, Damien said. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the desk threw light at an angle across her face, and he noticed for the first time the faint line of an old scar along her jaw. Thin, barely visible, the kind that had faded over a long time but never fully disappeared. Your father's death, she said finally. Damien's body went very still. Luca didn't believe it was natural. She held his gaze. He spent 8 months trying to prove it. He found something, not enough to take anywhere, but enough to change the direction of what he was looking into. A pause. He told me that the man who had access to your father's medication was the same man who first introduced the trafficking operation to the Viscari infrastructure. The silence between them was different now. Heavier. Damien's hands had moved from the desk to his knees, and he was aware of a sensation in his chest that was familiar from a specific category of moments in his life. The kind where the ground under a belief shifts, not violently, but with the slow, irreversible certainty of something geological. Vittorio introduced that operation, Damien said. Not a question. Vittorio built it. Her voice was careful and measured, like she was aware of the exact weight she was placing on each word. Luca found the original contracts, 3 offshore entities, all connecting back to a holding structure that Vittorio had maintained since before you were running the family. Your father found out. She stopped. And, Damien said, Luca believed your father was going to dismantle it, that he'd told Vittorio it was done, that he wasn't going to protect it anymore. She looked at her hands. He died 6 weeks later. Damien picked up his bourbon glass and set it back down without drinking. He thought about Vittorio at the wedding, both hands on his shoulders, that warm and even smile. He thought about 40 years of family. He thought about grief and what it does to a man's ability to see clearly. Why are you telling me this now? He said. Because Vittorio called today. She looked back up at him. And because I've been in this penthouse for 3 days, watching you conduct a private investigation you haven't told anyone about, and I think you already know most of what I just said, and I think you're deciding what to do about it, and I think the decision you make in the next week is going to determine whether we both survive this. The bluntness of it landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Damien looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid of me, he said. I've been afraid of worse. She said it simply, without drama, the statement of a fact rather than a display of bravery. Afraid of you would be redundant at this point. He almost said something then, something that would have been honest and therefore dangerous. He caught it before it reached his mouth and replaced it with, "Get some sleep." She stood. "You too." She walked out. He sat in the study until 3 a.m. and did not sleep. Crane came in person on the 5th day. He was a compact, forgettable-looking man in his early 50s, the kind of face that surveillance footage never quite captured clearly. He sat across from Damien in the penthouse study with a physical folder, not digital, never digital for this category of material, and placed it on the desk with the particular care of someone handling something that had already cost them several nights of discomfort. "The girl," Crane said. "Elena DeLuca." Damien looked at him. "The trafficking operation your uncle built in the 90s, there were federal raids in 2003 and 2004 that took down the surface layer. Public record, if you know what to search. 8 convictions. The deeper structure went underground." Crane opened the folder to a page of photographs. Among the missing children from that network, 22 confirmed cases, another 14 unconfirmed. There was a daughter, Judge Thomas DeLuca, murdered in his home in 2001, his wife the same night, his daughter taken from the scene. He tapped the photograph. Age 4. Damien looked at the photograph of a small, dark-haired child. Official status, Crane said, was presumed dead. Remains never recovered. Case went cold after the federal raids, assumed to be connected. No further investigation of the child's whereabouts because the assumption was she hadn't survived. "She survived," Damien said. "Someone got her out." Crane turned to another page. "We believe it was a mid-level member of the network who had a crisis of conscience. We're still tracing the chain of custody on this, but the trail goes through 3 different foster situations over approximately 8 years before a man named Peter Moretti filed papers as legal guardian in 2007. He paused. Moretti was a former merchant marine with no criminal record, no connection to the network that we can establish. He appears to have been approached specifically because he was the kind of man who would say yes and then disappear into a quiet life in Red Hook and not ask questions. She was given a new identity. Complete rebuild, birth certificate, school records, the works. Good quality work it held for 19 years. Crane closed the folder. It held until someone started looking. Damien looked up. Crane met his eyes. "Someone accessed the identity records 8 months ago," Crane said. "Before the marriage was arranged, someone went looking and found the seams." A pause. "The access was traced to a shell company in Delaware that roots back 3 layers deep, but it roots to a Vescari holding entity." The room was very quiet. "Which entity?" Damien said. Crane named it. It was one of Vittorio's. Damien stood up from his chair. He walked to the window. He stood looking out at Manhattan with his hands at his sides and his jaw tight and his breathing carefully controlled while the full architecture of it assembled itself in his head with the slow, awful clarity of something that had always been true but had needed this particular arrangement of facts to become visible. Vittorio had found her. Vittorio had found Elena De Luca, the surviving daughter of a judge his operation had murdered 20 years ago, living under a rebuilt identity in Red Hook. And rather than deal with her quietly, which would have been the obvious and the expected move, he had done something more elegant, more cruel. He had pointed Damien at her, had fed him the pendant, the connection, the narrative of Luca's obsession and destruction, knowing exactly what Damien would do with it, knowing that a grieving man looking for a target would arrange his own perfect trap, would bring her willingly inside the Viscari walls, under Damien's roof, under Damien's control, in a situation where her disappearance would be explained and her removal would be manageable and no one would ask questions. Damien would have handed her directly to the people who had been hunting her for 20 years. He had nearly done it. He pressed one hand flat against the cold glass. Behind him, Crane waited. "There's one more thing," Crane said. Damien turned around. Crane opened the folder again to the last page. Judge De Luca, before he was killed, he'd been building a case, a federal case, years in development, connecting organized crime entities on the East Coast to a trafficking network with political protection. He documented names, evidence, a sealed indictment that was sitting with a U.S. attorney when he died. A pause. The case collapsed after his death. Evidence went missing from the federal building. The U.S. attorney transferred out of the district 6 months later under murky circumstances. Damien stared at him. Several of the names in De Luca's original case file, Crane said carefully, appear in Viscari operational documents from the same period. The silence stretched. "How many names?" Damien said. "Enough." Crane left the folder on the desk and left. Damien stood alone in the study for a long time. He looked at the folder. He looked at the window. He thought about his father, a hard man, a complicated man, a man he had spent 20 years measuring himself against. He thought about the possibility that his father had known, had participated, had decided at some point, near the end, that he wanted it to stop. He thought about what Evelina had told him in this same room 3 nights ago. He died 6 weeks later. The anger that moved through him then was a different temperature than his usual anger. His usual anger was controlled, directional, useful, a tool. This was something else. This was the hot, structural kind that comes from betrayal by someone you trusted without question for your entire adult life. He picked up his phone. Sal answered on the second ring. "Clear my afternoon," Damien said, "and find out where Vittorio is having lunch today." "He's at the club on—" "Don't tell me on the phone." A pause. "Come here." He ended the call. He stood at the desk and looked at the folder for another moment. Then he walked down the hallway toward the bedroom wing. He knocked once on Evelina's door. She opened it. She looked at his face, and whatever she saw there made something in her own expression shift, not toward fear, but toward readiness, the specific alertness of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing and recognizes its arrival. "It was Vittorio," Damien said. She held his gaze. "All of it," he said. "The operation, my father, Luca, the marriage." He paused. "He found you. He knew who you were. He pointed me at you deliberately and let me build the rest myself." She exhaled slowly. "How much do you remember?" he said. "From before Peter Moretti and Red Hook and the new name." Her jaw tightened. "Enough," she said quietly. "Enough for what?" She looked at him with eyes that were level and exhausted and harder than they looked from a distance. "Enough to testify," she said. "If someone could guarantee that testifying wouldn't get me killed before I finished the sentence." Damien looked at her for a long moment. In the background of the penthouse, his phone began ringing. Sal calling back, probably, or one of his captains, or the ongoing machinery of an empire that had been built on things he was only now beginning to fully account for. He ignored it. "You have names," he said. "I have names. People connected to Vittorio's network." People who are still operating. She held his gaze. People who came to the estate last night and congratulated you on your marriage. The cold that moved through him then started at the base of his spine. He thought about the reception. 400 guests. The captains. The consiglieri. The politicians with soft hands. The careful way everyone had circulated, assessing, recalculating. The specific, terrible warmth of Vittorio's embrace at the door. How many of them were there last night? Damien said. She told him a number. He turned away from her doorway and walked back toward the study, and behind him the phone was still ringing, and somewhere in the city Vittorio Vescari was sitting down to lunch at his usual table, at his usual club, and somewhere in the sealed-off architecture of a federal case that had been buried for 20 years, the dead man's evidence was still waiting, and Damien Vescari understood now with the full weight of it that he had been standing in the middle of his enemy's plan since the moment he saw a silver pendant and decided it meant something simple. He picked up his phone. Not to answer Sal. To dial a number he had never dialed before, a number Crane had included in the file under a header that read, "Federal contact, use only when prepared to commit." He looked at the number for he stared at the number for 11 seconds. He knew because the clock on the laptop read 2:14 when he picked up the phone and 2:14 when he set it back down, and in those 11 seconds he ran the entire calculation. What calling that number would cost, what it would set in motion, whether a man who had spent his adult life on one side of a particular line could cross it and still recognize himself on the other side. He set the phone down without dialing, not from fear, from something more careful than fear. A federal contact was a door that only opened in one direction. Once you walked through it, you couldn't walk back, and Damien was not yet ready to burn everything down when he still didn't have the full picture. He needed more. He needed the names Evelina carried in her memory. He needed to understand the complete architecture before he started demolishing walls, because a man who demolished the wrong wall first could bring the whole structure down on himself. He needed Vittorio to not know any of this yet. He needed, for the first time in his life, to pretend with someone he had trusted completely. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and went to tell Evelina what they were going to do. She listened without interrupting. That was something he had noticed about her in the days since the wedding. She listened the way people listen when they have learned that interrupting costs more than it gains, when they've been in enough rooms where speaking at the wrong moment had consequences. She sat in the chair across from his desk and held her empty coffee cup and watched his face while he talked, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. "You want me to go to dinner?" she said. "Sunday. Weekly family dinner at the estate. You'll be expected regardless. With Vittorio. And 12 other people, half of whom were at our wedding." He kept his voice level. "You behave exactly as you have been. Quiet, observant, slightly guarded, which you are naturally, so that requires no performance." She looked at him. "And you," she said, "how will you behave?" "Like a man who has no idea what he knows." "Can you do that?" The question was direct and serious, not a challenge, not skepticism, but a genuine operational assessment of whether he was capable of sitting across from Vittorio Vescari and performing ignorance. "I've been doing it for 3 days already," Damien said. She considered that. Then she nodded. "There's something else," she said. "Tell me." She set the cup down and folded her hands in her lap. Outside the penthouse windows, the afternoon had gone gray and flat, the city moving below them in its usual indifferent rhythm. "I told you I remembered enough to testify," she said. "That's true. But there's a specific thing I remember. Something I've never told anyone. Not Luca. Not Peter Moretti. Not the social workers who processed me in 2007, because I was 4 years old when it happened, and I spent years not being sure if it was real or if it was something my mind constructed afterward." She paused. "I'm sure now." Damien waited. "The night my parents were killed," she said carefully, "there was a man in the house, before the others came. A man who came alone first, who I think was there to make sure something was arranged before the rest of it happened." She looked at her hands. "I was under the bed in my room. I heard voices. My father's voice and another voice. Someone my father knew, someone he was not afraid of right up until the moment he should have been." She stopped. You heard the voice, Damien said. I heard the voice. She looked up. I heard it again for the first time since I was 4 years old at our wedding reception. She held his gaze. It took me 2 days to be certain. I've been certain since yesterday morning. The room was absolutely still. Damien's throat was tight. Who? He said. She told him. The name was not Vittorio. Sal arrived at the penthouse 40 minutes later, and Damien met him in the front room alone. Sal was 52, built like something that had been compressed under pressure over a long period, with a broad, scarred face and hands that had done things they'd both agreed never to discuss in explicit terms. He had worked for the Viscari family for 30 years, for Damien specifically for 12 of them, and he was the closest thing Damien had to someone he trusted without caveat. He looked at Damien's face when he walked in and said nothing for a moment. Bad, Sal said. Sit down. Sal sat. Damien told him what he needed him to know. Not everything, not the federal contact, not the full depth of what Crane had found, but enough. He watched Sal's face during it. Sal was not an expressive man by nature, but there was a particular quality to his stillness that Damien had learned to read, and what he read during the telling was something he'd seen only a few times in 12 years. It was the stillness of a man recalibrating everything. When Damien finished, Sal sat for a long moment. Vittorio, Sal said. Vittorio. Another pause. How long? Longer than either of us has been in this room. Damien met his eyes. The operation predates my father's death, possibly connects to it. Sal's jaw moved. He was processing it. Damien watched him work through the implications, all the conversations, all the meetings, all the years of proximity to a man who had been running something beneath the floor of everything they thought they were building. What do you need from me? Sal said. I need you to behave exactly as normal through Sunday. I need Vittorio to have no indication that anything has changed, and I need you to very quietly confirm something for me. Damien gave him the second name, the one Evelina had heard at the wedding reception, the voice from her parents' house when she was 4 years old. Find out if that person had contact with Vittorio in the 8 months before the marriage was arranged. Sal looked at the name Damien had written on a piece of paper. He looked up. You're certain, Sal said. She's certain. Sal folded the paper into his breast pocket. He stood. At the door he stopped. Damien. He turned back. Your father. Do you want me to... Not yet, Damien said. One thing at a time. Sal left. Damien stood alone in the front room for a moment in the silence and thought about his father. A man he had believed he understood completely. A man whose death he had grieved with the specific intensity of someone who had never resolved a complicated relationship before it ended. He thought about the possibility that his father had tried to stop it, the possibility that stopping it had cost him his life. He thought about what it meant to grieve a man twice. Sunday came with cold, clear air and the particular quality of late autumn light that makes New York look like a city in a painting rather than a city anyone actually lives in. The Viscari estate sat behind its gates in the way it always did. Formal, excessive, impressive in the particular way of things built to display wealth, rather than to accommodate human beings. Cars in the drive, staff moving through the entrance, the smell of good food coming from somewhere inside. Damien and Evelina arrived together. In the car she had been silent for most of the drive. At one point, passing over the bridge, she had looked out the window with her hands folded in her lap and said quietly, He's going to watch me tonight. Let him, Damien said. He's going to try to determine how much I know. I know. He'll be subtle about it. So will you. She had turned from the window and looked at him then, and there was something in the look that was different from how she had looked at him in the early days of their arrangement. Less assessment, less calculation. Something that had a different quality to it. He had not examined it closely because examining it closely would have required him to acknowledge it, and acknowledging it would have changed the temperature of what he needed to maintain tonight. He held the car door for her when they arrived. It was a small gesture and entirely unlike him, and she noticed it, and he saw her notice it, and neither of them said anything. Inside, the family gathered in the east sitting room before dinner, as they always did. 12 people arranged in the choreography of family, kisses on cheeks, the refilling of glasses, the low-grade performance of affection between people who were also constantly measuring each other. 3 of Damien's captains and their wives. 2 cousins. A family lawyer named Ferrante, who had been attached to the Vescari orbit for so long, he had become indistinguishable from actual family. And Vittorio. He came toward them within 2 minutes of their arrival, arms open, that warm gravity of a man who moved through rooms as if they'd been assembled for him specifically. He embraced Damien first, then turned to Evelina with both hands extended. "My dear," he said, "you look wonderful. Marriage agrees with you already." Evelina took his hands and let him kiss her cheek. "Thank you, Vittorio," she said. Warm, correct, nothing excessive. Vittorio held her hands a moment longer than necessary, and in that moment Damien watched his uncle's eyes, not his smile, his eyes, moving across her face with the specific quality of a search rather than a greeting. Evelina gave him nothing. Her face was composed, pleasant, appropriately familial, and behind it absolutely nothing was visible. Damien found himself briefly and genuinely impressed by it. Vittorio released her hands and turned back to Damien with that same even smile. "You seem tired," Vittorio said. "Long week," Damien said. "The business of a new marriage." Vittorio chuckled. His eyes were assessing. "Come, I need your opinion on something before dinner." The pull aside. Damien had expected it. He followed Vittorio through the east sitting room and into the adjacent study. Vittorio's territory in the estate, a room Damien had sat in hundreds of times throughout his life, surrounded by his uncle's books and his uncle's photographs, and his uncle's particular arrangement of the world as he wanted it to appear. There was a painting on the far wall that Damien had looked at since childhood, a dark landscape from some Italian school, and tonight, looking at it, he thought about how many conversations had happened beneath it that had shaped his life without his knowledge. Vittorio closed the door. He crossed to the bar, poured 2 glasses of wine, offered one to Damien. Damien took it. "How is she settling in?" Vittorio said. He leaned against the desk with his glass in hand and his expression arranged into the particular version of warmth that family men use for family conversations. "Well enough," Damien said. "She's quiet." "She is." Guarded, Vittorio swirled his glass. "I noticed it at the wedding. She watches everything but gives very little back. Unusual quality." He paused. "Has she talked to you? About herself? Her past?" Damien looked at him. "She's talked about her childhood in Red Hook," Damien said. "Her father. Nothing remarkable." Vittorio nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already believed. "She grew up with very little," he said. "That kind of background shapes a person, makes them careful. Careful people can be difficult to read. A beat. Or difficult to trust." "I trust my wife," Damien said flatly. Vittorio smiled. "Of course." A pause. The study was quiet. From somewhere in the estate came the muffled sounds of the gathering. Voices, someone laughing, the clink of glasses. "There was something I wanted to mention," Vittorio said, with the tone of a man transitioning to a topic he had arranged the entire conversation to reach. "About the Moretti name, the family history." "What about it?" "I've been doing some reading." He set his glass down. "The Moretti bloodline has some complicated connections, old relationships with families that the Vescari organization worked hard to distance itself from in the 90s. Nothing criminal, nothing documented, but the kind of historical entanglement that can create complications if the wrong people start looking at it." He looked at Damien with that steady, measured gaze. "I mention it only because it might be worth understanding the full picture of who you've married, for your own protection." Damien looked at his uncle for a long moment. He thought about 41 pages, about a 4-year-old girl under a bed, about a pendant engraved with a rose crest. "I appreciate the concern," Damien said. "Always," Vittorio said. "Family first." They returned to the sitting room. Dinner was 2 hours of the specific, sustained performance that Damien had trained for his entire life. and it cost him more that night than it ever had before. He sat at his end of the table and ate and spoke when addressed and watched Vittorio across the length of it. Watched the way his uncle worked the table, the warmth he deployed strategically, the small, careful tests he ran on Evelina throughout the meal. A question about her childhood, phrased innocently. A comment about Red Hook that contained a specific detail, the name of a street, that would only be significant if she recognized why that street mattered to the history Vittorio was probing. A gentle, almost imperceptible thing that most people would not have caught. Evelina answered the street comment with blank, polite ignorance. Her face didn't change. Vittorio's face didn't change either. But something in his posture shifted by a degree. The particular micro-relaxation of a man who has run a test and received the result he needed. He believed she didn't know. Damien filed that away and kept eating. After dinner, the men gathered in the sitting room and the conversation moved to business, which meant that Evelina and the other wives migrated naturally toward the adjacent room. Damien watched her go and returned his attention to the room. 20 minutes into the business discussion, Damien's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at it under the table. Sal. One message. Confirmed. Contact between target and V. 9 months ago. Location, the East Wing. Damien put the phone away. He sat with the confirmation settling into him. The specific, terrible solidification of a suspicion into a fact. He looked at the lawyer, Ferrante, across the room, who was laughing at something one of the captains had said, and thought about what it meant that this man's voice lived in the memory of a 4-year-old girl who had spent 20 years trying to decide if what she remembered was real. It was real. Ferrante had been in the house. Ferrante T, who had sat in Viscari meetings for 30 years, who had drawn up contracts and managed legal exposure and positioned himself so deeply inside the family structure that removing him would require surgical precision, had been the advance man. Had gone to a judge's house before the rest of them arrived to ensure the variables were arranged correctly. Had listened to a man realize too late that the person he trusted was the one who had come to watch him die. Damien looked at his wine glass. He thought about the federal contact number on his phone. He thought about Evelina in the next room, sitting with women whose husbands had built the machine that destroyed her family, performing normalcy with a skill that should have been impossible given what she carried. He thought about Luca. 26 years old, renting a room under a false name, trying to save a girl he couldn't tell his brother about because telling his brother would have required trusting that his brother was not already too deep inside the thing he was trying to expose. That thought hit him like a fist. Luca hadn't told him. Not because he didn't trust Damien, because he didn't know if Damien was clean. He hadn't known. His own brother had looked at him and run the same calculation that everyone in this family ran, who is safe, who is compromised, who has been standing close enough to the wrong thing long enough that the wrong thing has become part of them, and had decided the risk was too large. Damien sat in the sitting room of his family's estate, surrounded by his captains and his uncle and a family lawyer who had been in a murdered judge's house 20 years ago. And he felt something that he had not felt since the night of Luca's funeral, the specific structural collapse of the floor under everything he'd believed was solid. He stood up. "Excuse me," he said, and walked out of the room. He went down the hallway toward the East Wing, not because he had a plan, but because he needed 30 seconds of empty space to put his face back together. The hallway was dim, lit by the low evening lights the estate ran after dark, and his footsteps were quiet on the stone floor. He stopped at the end of the hall. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. Then he heard voices from behind the closed door of the East Wing meeting room. Not conversation-level voices. Quieter than that. The specific near whisper of people who believe they are not being overheard. He stood very still. He moved closer to the door. Vittorio's voice. And Ferrante's. And a third voice he placed after 2 seconds. One of his captains. A man named Gennaro, who had been with the family since before Damien took over. He couldn't hear every word. Enough. "She knows more than she's saying. I saw it in her eyes at dinner." Vittorio's voice. Talking about Evelina. "Then we move sooner." Ferrante. Damien doesn't need to know until after. We've handled larger complications." A pause. "The same way as last time?" "However is cleanest." Damien stood in the hallway with his back flat against the wall and his heart doing something it had never done before. Not racing, not pounding, but beating with a cold, deliberate rhythm that felt like a countdown. They were talking about Evelina. However is cleanest, the same casual, administrative language that powerful men use when they are discussing the removal of a problem. The specific detachment of people who have done this before and will do it again and have arranged their internal architecture so that the word cleanest refers to logistics rather than to a human being. He moved away from the door before they could hear him. He walked back down the hallway with his face arranged into its default expression and his hands loose at his sides and everything that was happening inside him locked down so far beneath the surface that anyone watching him would have seen only a man returning from a brief absence. He went back into the sitting room. He sat down. He picked up his wine. He looked across the room at the doorway to the adjacent parlor where he could hear the women's voices, and he thought, she has 2 days at most. Maybe less if Vittorio is further along than the conversation suggested. He thought about the federal contact number. He thought about what calling it would cost. He thought about what not calling it would cost. He looked at Gennaro, his captain of 6 years, a man he had trusted with operations, with money, with the kind of decisions that could not be documented. Sitting across the room with his drink in his hand and his face arranged in the pleasant blankness of a man who had just agreed to participate in a murder and return to a dinner party. Damien looked at him for exactly the length of time it took to be certain. Then he looked away. 20 minutes later, on the drive back to the penthouse, Evelina sat beside him in the back seat with her hands in her lap and the city sliding past the windows and the silence between them, the specific kind that comes after something significant has already been decided but not yet said. He's going to move on me, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Damien said. She absorbed that. How long? She said. 48 hours. Maybe less. She looked out the window. The lights of the bridge moved across her face in sequence, regular and indifferent. Then we have 48 hours, she said. To do what? He said. She turned and looked at him directly, and in her eyes he saw something that had not been there a week ago. Not fear, not desperation, but the particular resolve of a person who has spent 20 years waiting to arrive at a specific moment and has finally, at great cost, arrived. To make sure that when it comes apart, she said, it comes apart all the way. Not just Vittorio, not just Ferrante. She held his gaze. All of it. Everyone whose name I remember from when I was 4 years old, everyone who sat at that dinner table tonight, everyone who built the thing that killed my family. She paused. And I need to know right now whether you're going to help me do that or whether you're going to protect whatever's left of the Vescari name. Damien looked at her. The car moved through the city. He thought about his father. He thought about Luca in a rented room, alone, trying to do the right thing without anyone to stand beside him. He thought about 20 years of a machine that had been running beneath the floor of everything he believed he was building, fed by people he had trusted and protected and called family. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He pulled up the federal contact number. He turned the screen toward her so she could see it. I've been holding this number for 4 days, he said. I need you to tell me that what you remember is enough. That if I call this number and burn everything down, we're not doing it on a foundation that collapses before we finish. She looked at the screen, then she looked at him. My father was a federal judge, she said quietly. He spent 4 years building a case. He documented everything, names, dates, accounts, transactions. He hid the documentation before they came for him. She paused. I know where he hid it. I've known since I was old enough to understand what Luca was trying to tell me. Her voice was steady and flat and completely certain. Call the number. Outside the car windows, New York moved past in its usual relentless way, indifferent and blazing and full of the ongoing lives of millions of people who had no idea that in the back seat of a car crossing the bridge, the man who ran one of the city's most feared criminal empires was dialing a federal contact for the first time in his life while the woman sitting beside him. The call lasted 9 minutes. Damien spoke in the flat, precise voice he used when giving information that could not be misunderstood. And the man on the other end, a federal organized crime supervisor named Reyes, who had apparently been waiting for a call like this for longer than Damien had been running the Vescari family, listened without interrupting, and asked 3 specific questions at the end, all of which Damien answered. When he ended the call, the car was 3 blocks from the penthouse. Evelina had sat beside him through the entire 9 minutes without moving, without speaking, watching the city through the glass with her hands folded in her lap. When he lowered the phone, she turned and looked at him. "What did he say?" she said. "He said 48 hours is not enough time to position properly." Damien put the phone in his pocket. He needs the documentation first, physical evidence before he can move without the risk of a jurisdictional problem killing it before it starts. "The documentation is in New Jersey," she said. "A storage unit in a facility in Hoboken. My father used the facility under a company name, a shell he built specifically for the case file. I have the key." She paused. "I've had it for 11 years. Luca found the reference in the materials he recovered and traced it back to me." She looked at her hands. "He made me memorize the address the last time I saw him." The car stopped in front of the penthouse building. Neither of them moved immediately. "If Vittorio is moving in 48 hours, Damien said, he has people watching this building already." "Probably since yesterday," she said. "Then going to Hoboken tonight is a problem." "Not going to Hoboken is a larger problem." He looked at her in the dark of the back seat. The city light came through the glass at angles, and her face in it was very still and very focused. The face of someone who had been preparing for exactly this decision for a long time and had already made it. He opened the car door. "Give me an hour," he said. The hour was the longest of the night and possibly of the year. Damien went upstairs and made 4 calls. To Sal, to Crane, to a driver he trusted whose name was not in any Viscari operational document, and to a woman named Marta who ran a courier network out of a dry cleaning shop in Astoria and owed Damien a favor she had been carrying for 3 years. He spoke to each of them briefly, in terms specific enough to be actionable and vague enough that none of them held anything dangerous if the wrong person was listening. While he made the calls, Evelina packed. Not much. A bag smaller than the one she'd brought to the wedding, a change of clothes, a phone, the key on a plain chain around her neck that she'd been wearing under her clothing since she was 15 years old. She moved through the penthouse bedroom with the practiced efficiency of someone who had packed under pressure before, who understood the difference between what you needed and what you wanted and had long ago learned to leave the second category behind. She came out of the bedroom while Damien was finishing the last call and stood in the hallway and waited. He ended the call. He looked at her. She was wearing dark clothing, her hair pulled back, no jewelry except the chain. She looked like she had stripped away everything that wasn't essential, and what remained was a person who was smaller than her wedding day version and considerably more dangerous. "Sal will intercept anyone watching the building on the north side," Damien said. "The driver is in the parking structure below. We go down through the service elevator, not the main bank." She nodded. "If we get separated at any point—" "We won't," she said. "If we do, we won't." Her voice was flat and certain. "I didn't survive 20 years to get separated from the only person who knows the full plan 3 blocks from my apartment." He held her gaze for a moment. "Let's go," he said. The service elevator was slow and smelled of cleaning chemicals and the kind of institutional fluorescent light that makes everyone look slightly ill. They stood side by side in it and neither spoke. Damien was aware of the space between them, 6 inches less, and of the warmth coming off her in the cold of the elevator, and of his own heartbeat, which was running faster than he preferred. The parking structure was 3 levels below ground. The driver, a compact, careful man named Orrin, who had been driving for Damien for 4 years and had the particular quality of never asking questions and never appearing curious, had a gray sedan positioned near the service exit with the engine running. They got in. Damien sat up front, Evelina in the back. "Hoboken," Damien said, straight shot. "If anyone is on us, don't lose them before the bridge. Lose them after. I don't want them to know the direction until we're already through." Orrin pulled out without responding. That was the thing about Orrin. He didn't respond. He simply drove. The city moved past. Late Sunday night, the traffic light but not absent. Cabs, delivery vehicles, the occasional group of people outside a bar. The tunnel entrance came up and Orrin moved through it smoothly, and on the other side the city fell away and became the particular quiet of New Jersey at night. industrial and flat and lit by the orange glow of port facilities along the water. Damien checked his mirrors twice. Nothing obvious. That meant either they weren't followed or whoever was following them was good enough not to be obvious, and both of those possibilities required the same response, which was to proceed. "Storage facility is on Willow," Evelina said from the back. "Unit 34. The lock takes a standard key, but the unit itself has a secondary panel. Combination. I'll handle it." "What's in it?" Damien said. "Files. Physical documents. My father kept everything on paper for the case-sensitive material. Some photographs. A recorded audio cassette from a meeting he documented covertly." She paused. "And a sealed letter addressed to the U.S. Attorney's Office, prepared for delivery. He wrote it knowing he might not be the one to deliver it." Oren pulled into the storage facility's outer lot and cut the headlights. The facility was the kind of place that existed in the middle distance of most cities. A long, low building of corrugated metal, security lighting on a sensor system, a keypad entry at the vehicle gate. At this hour, empty. The gate was closed. Evelina got out of the car before Damien could say anything. He got out after her. She went to the keypad at the gate and entered a code, 7 digits, without hesitation, and the gate slid open. She had memorized it. Of course she had. She had been carrying these details inside her for over a decade, the way you carry the specific information that might one day be the only thing standing between you and the people who had been looking for you your whole life. They moved through the facility on foot, the gravel loud under their shoes in the silence. Unit 34 was at the far end of the second row. The door was padlocked. Evelina produced the key from the chain at her neck and opened it in 2 seconds flat. Inside, darkness, the smell of old paper and cool, dry air, and a metal shelf unit running the length of the space. On the shelves, a row of archive boxes, each labeled in a handwriting that had faded at the edges but was still clear. Neat, methodical. The handwriting of a man who had been building something careful and precise. Evelina stood in front of the boxes for a moment. She put one hand on the shelf. Her breathing changed. Not dramatically, but enough that Damien heard it in the quiet. The specific involuntary shift of a person confronting something that carries more weight than any object should. He said nothing. He stood behind her and gave her the moment. She straightened. She turned to the secondary panel mounted on the interior wall, a small combination lockbox, institutional gray, and entered a 6-digit combination without looking away from the shelf. The box opened. Inside, a single folded card with a handwritten note on it and a USB drive. She pocketed both. Then she turned to the archive boxes and began pulling them methodically. There were 7 of them, each roughly the weight of a full ream of paper. She handed them to Damien one at a time, and he stacked them and carried them back to the car in 2 trips while she checked the shelf for anything remaining. 6 minutes from the time they'd entered the gate to the time Oren closed the trunk. Damien was breathing harder from the carrying than he wanted to admit. He stood beside the car for a moment and looked up and down the access road. Still empty. "Reyes needs this tonight," Damien said. "We can't take it back to the penthouse. There's a federal field office, not the field office. Too exposed, too many people who might have the wrong affiliations. Reyes gave me an address." He looked at Oren. "I'm going to give you a location. You take her there directly. I'll follow separately." Evelina turned sharply. "That's not... If Vittorio has people on me, I draw them away from the documentation. If I go with you and we're followed, both objectives fail." He met her eyes. "Oren is clean. Reyes is expecting the delivery. You get there, you hand over the boxes, you stay there until I contact you." "And where are you going?" she said. He looked at her. "To finish this the other way," he said. Her jaw tightened. "Damien." Her voice was low and even. "If you go to Vittorio tonight without the federal cover in place, you're walking into a room with a man who has already decided to kill me and has 30 years of infrastructure behind that decision. You understand that?" "I understand that if I don't move on him tonight, he moves on us tomorrow morning, and we lose the initiative entirely." He kept his voice steady. "The documentation goes to Reyes. That side of it is done whether I survive the next 4 hours or not. The federal case doesn't need me to function." Something moved across her face. Not fear, something angrier and more complicated than fear. "Get in the car," she said. "Evelina, get in the car." Harder now. "Both of us go to Reyes, then we decide together. You don't get to make the martyr decision unilaterally. That's not how this works." He looked at her for a long moment in the cold New Jersey air, with the port lights behind her and the smell of the water coming off the bay. He got in the car. Reyes was a woman in her late 40s with short, gray-threaded hair and the kind of face that had been made tired by a specific category of work and was entirely at peace with that tiredness. She met them at a location that was neither a field office nor anything that looked like a government facility. A private address in a residential building in Jersey City, a safe house that had the particular quality of places used for exactly this purpose: anonymous furniture, heavy curtains, a landline phone, and a small team of 3 agents who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been awake since before they arrived. She shook Evelina's hand first. Something about that registered with Evelina. Damien saw it in the slight loosening of her shoulders, the first real physical relaxation she'd shown since they left the penthouse. Reyes went through the archive boxes with controlled speed, opening each one, checking the contents against something she appeared to be comparing against an existing document. A manifest, Damien realized, that someone had apparently provided in advance. Luca's materials. Whatever Luca had managed to get out before he died. After 15 minutes, she looked up. "This is enough," she said, simply. "This is more than enough." She looked at Damien. "The 48-hour timeline is a problem," she said. "My office can move, but there are jurisdictional notifications that require—" "He's moving on her tomorrow morning," Damien said. "The timeline isn't mine." Reyes looked at Evelina. Evelina met her gaze. "Vittorio Vescari had a conversation tonight that I believe was about authorizing my removal. My husband heard part of it." She paused. "There is also a second individual, a family lawyer named Ferrante, who I can place at the scene of my parents' murder when I was 4 years old. He is currently a flight risk if he becomes aware that any of this has been activated." Reyes absorbed this. She turned back to her team and issued 3 short instructions in a tone that left no room for questions. Then she came back to Damien. "We need you out of circulation tonight," she said. "Both of you. Here." "That's not—" Damien started. "Not a request." Reyes looked at him with the flat directness of a woman who had sat across from more dangerous men than him and had not found them particularly impressive. "You called me, Mr. Vescari. You handed me what I need. Now you stay out of the way and let me use it. If you go back into the city tonight and do whatever you're thinking about doing, you compromise the case before it starts and potentially give Vittorio's lawyers an obstruction narrative that gets half of this thrown out." Damien stood very still. He looked at his phone. He looked at Reyes. He thought about the underground casino beneath the Vescari Club. He thought about the specific satisfaction of dragging his uncle out of a private meeting in front of witnesses and making everything that had been hidden visible in one violent public moment. He thought about Luca. He put the phone in his pocket. "How long?" he said. 6 hours, Reyes said. "Maybe less." Damien sat down. The 6 hours were the worst kind of waiting, the kind with no movement permitted and no productive action available, and too much space for the mind to operate in. He sat in a chair in the safe house living room while Reyes and her team worked in the adjacent room, voices low, the occasional sound of a call being made or a document being processed. Evelina sat across from him, back straight, hands in her lap, and they existed in the specific proximity of 2 people who had been through the last week together and had no more performance left in them. At some point, 2 in the morning, maybe 2:30, she said quietly, "Your father tried to stop it." He looked at her. Luca believed it, based on what he found. She met his eyes. "He said your father had started moving money out of the relevant accounts, that he'd told Vittorio the operation was finished, that whatever he'd allowed or ignored over the years, he'd made a decision at the end." Damien looked at the wall. "That's not exoneration," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not. It's just something." "Yes." The word sat in the room between them, and neither of them tried to do anything more with it. At 3:15, Damien's phone vibrated. Sal. He answered immediately. Sal's voice was tight in a way Damien had heard only a handful of times. Vittorio moved the timeline up. He's not waiting until morning. A pause, the specific pause of a man delivering information he knows is going to land badly. He sent 4 men to the penthouse 40 minutes ago. When they found it empty, he called Gennaro. Damien stood up. Where is he now? The estate. He's been calling you. You haven't been answering. I know. Damien, Sal's voice dropped. He's also made a call to someone outside the organization. I couldn't get the full content, but the name came up. A pause. Peter Moretti. The cold came back, again. The specific flooding cold that Damien had felt in the penthouse study reading Crane's file, now more acute, more immediate. Peter Moretti, the dock worker in Red Hook, the man who had hidden Elena DeLuca for 11 years and kept her alive and called her his daughter and asked nothing in return. Vittorio had found him. Of course he had. If Evelina was beyond reach, Vittorio would apply pressure through the only person she had left. Damien turned toward the adjacent room. Reyes. She appeared in the doorway. One look at his face, and she was already moving. Peter Moretti, Damien said. Red Hook. He's the man who raised her. Vittorio just put a target on him. How fast can you— Give me the address, Reyes said. Evelina was on her feet. She gave the address from memory. The street, the building number, the apartment, all of it in a flat, rapid voice that didn't break. Her face had gone white under the safe house lighting, and her jaw was locked, and her hands, which had been steady since they'd left the estate, were not entirely steady now. Reyes was already on the phone. The next 4 minutes were the kind of 4 minutes that exist in a specific category. The category of time passing, while other people handle something critical, and the only available action is to stand and breathe and not come apart. Evelina stood with her arms crossed and her back to the wall, and Damien stood beside her and said nothing because nothing was useful to say. Then Reyes lowered her phone. We have units en route, she said. 8 minutes out. 8 minutes. Either enough or not enough. Evelina said nothing. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for 1 second, the first crack in the composure, brief and immediately controlled. And then her hand came down, and her face went still again. Damien looked at her. He thought about telling her something reassuring. He decided against it because she was not a person who wanted to be reassured. She was a person who wanted accurate information delivered without softening, and the accurate information was that 8 minutes was 8 minutes, and it would either be enough or it wouldn't, and there was nothing either of them could do about it from this room. Instead, he said, Peter Moretti is the reason you survived. She looked at him. Whatever happens tonight, he said, that's already true. Nobody changes that. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes didn't change. I know that, she said, but something in the way she said it told him that hearing it from someone else in this room at this hour had done something, small and specific and not nothing. Reyes's phone rang. She answered, listened, looked at Evelina. He's safe, she said. Units reached him. He's secure. Evelina exhaled. One breath, long and slow, and then her spine straightened back to its full height, and the composure resettled into place like armor clicked back into position. She looked at Damien. Now, she said. He understood the word. Reyes turned to her team. The pace in the adjacent room shifted into something higher and more deliberate. Calls being made, positions being coordinated, the machinery of federal response accelerating toward the point of action. Dawn was 3 hours away. The warrants Reyes had been building since Damien's call were apparently closer to actionable than she had let on. Damien stood in the center of the safe house living room and understood that the next phase of this was not his to execute, that the part he was built for, the direct confrontation, the physical assertion of consequence, was being handled by a different kind of institution with a different kind of authority, and that his role from this moment was to stay out of the way and let the mechanism he had set in motion do the work he had fed it. He understood this. He did not find it easy. At 4:40 in the morning, Reyes received confirmation that warrants had been signed by a federal judge and that coordinated teams were in position at 6 locations simultaneously, including the Viscari estate. At 4:53, she received confirmation that Vittorio Viscari had been taken into custody at the estate without incident, which meant he'd had no warning, which meant the containment had been clean. At 4:58, Ferrante was taken from his apartment on the Upper East Side. Gennaro at 5:12, from a car outside a bar in Astoria. Each confirmation came through Reyes's phone in the same flat procedural tone of an institution doing what it was designed to do, and each one landed in the safe house living room like something being set down after being carried a very long way. Damien sat with his elbows on his knees and listened to each one. Evelina stood at the window with her arms crossed, looking out at the gray pre-dawn light over the Hudson. At 5:30, Reyes came to stand in the doorway between the 2 rooms. "There's a problem," she said. Both of them turned. "Vittorio agreed to come in without incident," Reyes said. "He's been cooperative since the moment of arrest. Almost too cooperative." She paused. "He's been asking for a deal since the car ride over. He says he has information the government will want." Damien looked at her. "He says the trafficking operation is not dismantled." Reyes kept her voice level. "He says the structure that operated in the 90s and that your brother discovered rebuilding. It never stopped. He says there is a current operation, active, with a procurement network that has been running for the last 7 years under new management." A pause. "And he says the person running it now is not anyone we currently have in custody." The room was absolutely still. "Who?" Damien said. Reyes looked at him with the specific expression of a person about to deliver information that will require the recipient to revise something fundamental. "He says it's someone you've trusted completely," she said. "Someone who has been inside your operations for over a decade. Someone who, until tonight, you had no reason to doubt." Damien's whole body went very still. He ran the names. The short list of people who fit that description. The people who had access, who had proximity, who had been close enough to know everything and had never been suspected because their position made suspicion feel disloyal. Reyes said the name, and Damien looked up, and across the room Evelina turned from the window, and the name hung in the air of the safe house in the gray early morning light above the Hudson like something that had been waiting in a particular location for a very long time, patient and terrible, for someone to finally say it out loud. And the door to the safe house opened behind them both because no one had been watching it, because they'd believed they were secure. And the man whose name had just been spoken stepped through it with a gun already raised in his face. The name was Sal. Damien heard it come out of Rhea's mouth and felt it land somewhere below the level of thought, not in his mind, but in his body, in the specific place where a person registers the collapse of something they had built their weight on. 12 years, 30 years for the family before that. The man he had called first when his brother died. The man he had told everything to, piece by piece, over 4 careful days of thinking he was building a perimeter of trust. He had been building a wire. The door opened and Sal came through it, and the gun was already up, and Damien moved before the thought completed itself. Not toward cover, not toward distance, but forward and sideways. The instinct of a man who had grown up in rooms where hesitation was the most expensive option available. He hit Sal's gun arm at the wrist with his left forearm, and the shot went into the ceiling, and the sound of it in the enclosed space of the safe house was enormous, a physical thing. And then they were grappling in the narrow entryway with Sal's considerable weight against him and the gun somewhere between them. Behind him he heard Reyes shouting and the sound of her team moving. Sal was 52 and built like compressed stone, and he had 30 years of violence behind him that didn't show in his face. He drove Damien backward into the wall hard enough to crack the plaster and got his gun hand partially free, and Damien caught his wrist again and twisted with everything he had, and the gun hit the floor and skittered. Then Evelina picked it up. She came across the room from the window in 4 steps and had the gun up in both hands with the practiced stance of someone who had learned to shoot correctly and had not forgotten, and her voice was level and cold and utterly without theatrics. "Stop," she said. Sal stopped. Damien stepped back, breathing hard. His shoulder had taken the wall badly, and his left arm felt wrong in a way he was filing away for later examination. He looked at Sal. Sal looked back at him. The expression on Sal's face was the one Damien had never seen there before. Not anger, not calculation, not the particular blankness that Sal used for professional situations. Something raw, something that in another man in another context might have looked like grief. Reyes's team had their weapons out and were moving to flank. Reyes herself was on the phone, clipped and precise, calling in the breach. "How long?" Damien said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Not from weakness. From the specific register of a man asking a question he needs answered cleanly, without performance, because the performance would cost him something he couldn't currently afford to spend. Sal looked at him. "Long enough?" Sal said. "How long?" "Since before you took over." A pause. "Since your father." The room was very quiet except for Reyes on the phone. Damien looked at the man he had trusted completely for 12 years and tried to find the seam where the deception had lived and couldn't locate it, which was the worst part. Not that Sal had done it, but that he had done it so completely, so consistently, with such apparent and genuine loyalty layered over the top of it that Damien could not find a single moment in 12 years of shared history that had felt false. "Vittorio," Damien said. "He brought me in," Sal said, "before you were running anything. I was 20 years old and your father's organization was the only world I knew. And Vittorio offered me something that seemed like an upgrade." He said it without apology, without self-pity, with the flat tone of a man stating the facts of his own history the way you state facts about weather. By the time I understood the full picture of what I was inside, I was too far in to walk out. "You could have told me." "When?" Sal looked at him with something that was almost anger. "When you were 17 and I was driving you to your brother's school? When you were 23 and I was standing beside you at your father's burial? When would have been the right moment to tell you that the man who helped raise you had been working against you since before you knew what working meant?" Damien said nothing. "I kept you alive," Sal said. His voice had something in it now that was harder to categorize. 17 times in 12 years, Vittorio suggested, dealing with problems in ways that would have included you. 17 times I found a different solution. He paused. "That's not exoneration. I know what it is, but it's what it is." Reyes lowered her phone. She looked at Sal and then at Damien. "We need to move," she said. One of her agents took Sal's arms. Sal went without resistance. The absolute absence of struggle in it, the complete submission, had the quality of someone setting down something they had been carrying for a very long time. He let himself be walked toward the door, and at the threshold, he stopped and looked back at Damien one more time. "The operation Vittorio mentioned," Sal said. "The current one. The procurement network." He met Damien's eyes. "I have the locations. All of them. I'll give them everything." A pause. "Not for a deal. I don't want a deal." He looked away. "Just because it should be done." Then he was gone through the door. Damien stood in the entryway with his back against the cracked plaster wall and looked at the place where Sal had been standing. His shoulder was starting to make itself loudly known. His left hand had a cut on it from somewhere in the grappling that he hadn't noticed until now. He looked at it for a moment. A thin line across the palm, not deep, bleeding with the moderate persistence of surface wounds. Evelina came to stand beside him. She looked at his hand. She went to the safe house kitchen without comment, found a dish towel, brought it back and pressed it against his palm. She did it practically, without ceremony, the way someone performs a useful action because it needs to be done. He let her. They stood like that for a moment in the entryway of a safe house in Jersey City at 5:40 in the morning, while outside the machinery of federal consequence continued to move through the city. "Sal," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't. I know." She looked up at him. "That one's not on you." He wanted to disagree. The habit of taking responsibility for his organization, for the people in it, for every vector by which the Viscari name caused damage, was so deeply built into him that accepting the limitation of it felt like surrender. But she was holding a dish towel against his cut hand and looking at him with eyes that were exhausted and clear and not interested in him performing anything, and he didn't disagree. "Your hand needs actual attention," she said. "Later," he said. "Now," she said. "There's a first aid kit under the kitchen sink. I saw it when I got the towel." He looked at her. We're not going to be useful to anyone in the next 6 hours, she said. Reyes has what she needs. The warrants are moving. Peter is safe. She kept her voice level. Sit down and let me clean your hand. He sat down. The sun came up over the Hudson while Reyes worked. Damien and Evelina sat in the safe house kitchen and drank bad coffee from a machine that had seen better years and listened to the activity in the adjacent room. Calls, confirmations, the systematic sound of an institutional response to information that had been waiting to be used for 20 years. Through the kitchen window, the sky went from black to dark blue to the particular pale gray of early morning before color arrives, and then the first light hit the water and the river went briefly gold. Reyes appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:20. She looked at both of them with the face of a woman who had been awake all night doing demanding work and had the specific, sustainable energy of someone sustained by purpose rather than rest. 17 arrests as of this hour, she said. Vittorio is in federal custody. Ferrante is in federal custody. Gennaro, Sal. She paused. The 6 locations Sal provided for the current operation, 5 have been confirmed and secured. The 6th is being processed. She looked at Evelina. There are 14 individuals currently in protective custody who were recovered from that 6th location. A pause. Adult women, most of them. All alive. Evelina put down her coffee cup. She looked at the table surface for a moment. Then she looked up at Reyes. Are they getting support? Not just processing. Actual, we have advocates on site, Reyes said. That process has already started. Evelina nodded. Once. The nod of a person who has asked the most important question and received the answer they needed and can now allow themselves to put it down briefly. Reyes looked at Damien. Your situation is more complicated, she said. He had been expecting this. How complicated, he said. The cooperation you've provided, the documentation, the access, all of it is significant and will be weighed accordingly. But you run a criminal organization. The federal government is not in the business of issuing clean slates. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, which he interpreted as a sign that what followed was going to be a real conversation rather than a procedural statement. What you do in the next 6 months will matter more than anything you've done in the previous 6 years. The organization needs to be dismantled in ways that are verifiable and ongoing. Operations, accounts, structures, personnel, all of it documented and surrendered, not just the parts connected to the trafficking network. Everything. He looked at her. I know, he said. There will be charges, she said, not negotiable. The scope and the outcome will depend on cooperation that has to be real and has to be continuous. She met his eyes. I need you to understand what real means in this context. Not selective. Not the parts that are convenient. All of it. I understand, he said. She studied his face for a moment, with the evaluating quality of someone who had heard that answer many times from many people and had developed an accurate sense of when it was genuine. She appeared to reach a conclusion. We'll begin the formal process in 3 hours, she said. I'd suggest you use the time to rest if you can. She stood and went back to her team. Damien sat at the kitchen table of the safe house in Jersey City with his bandaged hand around a bad cup of coffee and looked out the window at the morning light on the Hudson and thought about everything the Vescari name had been built on and what would be left of it when the dismantling was finished and found, to his own mild surprise, that the thought of its absence didn't feel the way he would have expected. It felt like putting down something heavy. So, they let him see Peter Moretti at 10 that morning. He was being held at a protective location in Brooklyn, not in custody, simply kept safe until the situation was sufficiently resolved to allow him to return to his apartment in Red Hook. He was sitting in a folding chair in a bare room with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking when Damien came in, and he looked up with the face of a man who had been through a difficult night and had not found it particularly surprising given the general tenor of his life. He was 67. Weathered in the specific way of men who had spent decades doing physical work outdoors. His hands were enormous and still and resting on his knees, and his eyes, when they looked at Damien, were the eyes of a man conducting a very thorough assessment without any particular rush. Damien sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. She's safe, Damien said. Peter Moretti looked at him for a long moment. I know, he said. They told me. A pause. I want to hear it from you. She's safe, Damien said again. Reyes has her. Nobody is going to touch her. Peter looked at him with eyes that had the quality of something that had been measuring him since he walked through the door and had not yet finished. I want to know something, Peter said. Ask. The marriage. Peter's voice was even. You arranged it to punish her, for something you thought she'd done to your brother. It wasn't a question. He'd been briefed on enough of it, apparently, to understand the shape of it. Yes, Damien said. You put her in the middle of the people who'd been hunting her for 20 years. Yes. Peter looked at him. I know what I did, Damien said. He kept his voice level. I can't undo it. I'm not going to explain it in terms that make it more comfortable than it is. The old man studied him. She doesn't blame you, Peter said. It came out neither as defense nor accusation, simply as information. I know, Damien said. She should. She's not interested in should. Peter picked up his coffee cup and looked at it and put it down again. That girl has spent her whole life not having the luxury of should. She deals with what is. He paused. She gets that from neither of her parents. It came from somewhere she built herself. Damien said nothing. I'm going to ask you a question, Peter said, and I want you to think about it before you answer it. Take whatever time you need. Damien waited. What are you going to do now? Peter said. Not with the case, not with the organization, with her. Damien looked at the old man's face, the steady, unhurried patience of it, the quality of someone who had made one large and consequential decision 23 years ago to take in a child that wasn't his, and had organized everything since then around making that decision mean something. I'm going to ask her what she wants, Damien said. Peter looked at him for a long moment. That, he said, is the first intelligent thing I've heard anyone say in about 36 hours. He picked up his coffee again, and this time he drank it. The formal process with Reyes lasted 4 hours that first day, and would last, in various forms, for the next several months. Damien sat across from federal agents and prosecutors and gave them what they asked for with the same flat precision he gave everything, and the scope of what he handed over was significant enough that two of the prosecutors, at separate points, stopped writing and looked at him with expressions that contained something he chose to interpret as respect rather than examine too closely. He kept nothing back. It was the decision he had made at some point in the kitchen of the safe house watching the light come up on the Hudson, and having made it, he found no reason to revisit it. The organization had been built on things that could not be uncoupled from the damage they'd caused. You could not extract the legitimate from the illegitimate the way you might separate ingredients. It had been integrated too long, too thoroughly. The only honest action was to surrender it whole. He did. 3 weeks later, the snow came to New York. Not the first snow of the season, that had been in November, light and melted by noon, but the first real snow, the kind that settled and stayed, that covered the city in the particular temporary quiet that only snow can produce, where the hard edges of everything get softened for a few hours and the noise drops, and even Manhattan becomes something approaching still. Damien was not living in the penthouse. The penthouse was part of a Viscari asset inventory that had been transferred to a federal process that would take months to fully resolve. He was in a smaller apartment in the West Village, leased, not owned, nothing that bore the Viscari name, that contained very little furniture and no paintings and 2 good lamps and a kitchen that functioned. He had been there for 11 days. On the 12th day, Evelina moved in. Not with ceremony, not with discussion. She arrived with a bag, the same size as the one she'd carried out of the penthouse the night of the drive to Hoboken, and set it down in the bedroom and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the snow through the window. He sat across from her. Peter called, she said. I know. I talked to him yesterday. She looked at him. He likes you. He's conducting a years-long evaluation, Damien said. He hasn't reached a conclusion yet. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, the nearest approximation she'd offered in weeks, and it was enough. Outside the window, the snow kept falling on the West Village, on the brownstones and the quiet streets, on a city that had woken up 3 weeks ago to the news of a major federal organized crime arrest and had moved on with its usual speed to the next crisis, the next story, the next thing demanding its attention. Reyes called too, Evelina said. About the deposition. Next week. She looked at her coffee. I've been thinking about what comes after it. He waited. There's an organization, she said. They work with trafficking survivors, advocacy, legal support, the process of navigating what comes after the immediate crisis. She paused. They've asked if I would consult, not publicly, behind the structure. She looked up. I said I'd think about it. What are you thinking? He said. She was quiet for a moment. I'm thinking that I've spent 20 years surviving the same thing that other people are in the middle of surviving right now, she said. And that might be the most useful thing I have. She looked at him. Not the pendant, not the memory of my father's voice in a file, just the fact of having come through it. He looked at her across the kitchen table of a small apartment in the West Village while the snow fell outside, and thought about a woman who had walked down an aisle at her own wedding toward a man who had arranged it as a trap and had managed, through some combination of endurance and intelligence and a specific quality of inner architecture that he still didn't fully understand, to survive that and everything behind it, and arrive here, in this kitchen, on this morning, making plans. Do it, he said. She looked at him. The consulting, he said. Do it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the window. They sat with the snow and the coffee and the particular quiet of a morning that contained no immediate crisis for the first time in longer than either of them could precisely identify. And the quiet had a different quality than silence. It had the quality of something earned, something that had cost enough that its presence now meant something. The deposition took 3 days. Evelina sat in a federal building in Lower Manhattan and answered questions for 26 hours across those 3 days with precision and without theater, and the people conducting the questioning, experienced people who had heard difficult things delivered in many different registers, took note of the specific quality of her testimony, the way she gave detail without embellishment, the way she maintained eye contact without performing composure, the way she answered the hardest questions the same way she answered the easy ones. On the 3rd day, during a break in the afternoon, she sat in a hallway on a wooden bench, and Reyes sat beside her with 2 cups of bad coffee from a vending machine and handed her one. They sat for a minute. Your father would have been proud of this, Reyes said. Evelina looked at the cup in her hands. I don't know what my father would have been, she said. I was 4 years old. Reyes nodded. She accepted the correction without apology. Then for what it's worth coming from me, she said, this testimony is going to matter, for years. Cases built on this, prosecutions, policy changes. It's going to have a reach that goes beyond what you can see right now from this hallway. Evelina looked at the wall across from her. I know, she said. That's why I'm still here. They drank the bad coffee and went back inside. Vittorio pled guilty in February. Ferrante pled guilty in March, after his defense team examined the evidence and apparently reached the same conclusion that everyone who had examined it reached. Sal gave his full testimony in closed session and received the only thing he had said he wanted. Not a deal, not a reduction, not anything that would have required the government to pretend his 3 decades of involvement were something other than what they were. He gave them everything they asked for and sat with the consequences and did not complain about them. Damien heard this through Reyes and filed it in the part of him that dealt with things he could not fully resolve and had learned to carry without resolution. Gennaro fought it. He lost. The active trafficking operation, the current one that Sal had provided the locations for, was dismantled across 11 months of continued federal work that extended beyond the Vescari network into adjacent organizations, other families, political connections, individuals in positions of public trust whose names appeared in the evidence and generated, when their cases finally became public, the specific kind of outrage that lasts through several news cycles before being replaced by the next thing. 14 women recovered from the 6th location, 2 others from subsequent raids. A total count, by the end of the investigation, that Reyes shared with Evelina in a private briefing, and that Evelina received sitting very still with her hands in her lap, and her face showing nothing because some numbers require a private room to process. 6 months after the snow in the West Village, it was summer. The apartment had acquired furniture. Not much. Damien was not a man who accumulated objects, and Evelina had learned to travel light, but the particular furniture of people who had decided to stay: a decent couch, a kitchen table that had been replaced because the first one was too small, books in multiple rooms. One evening in July, Evelina was getting ready for an event, a fundraiser for the survivor advocacy organization she had been consulting with for 4 months, the first one at which she had agreed to appear not behind the structure but in front of it, listed in the program under her real name for the first time: Elena DeLuca. She stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom, adjusting something at her collar. The summer dress had short sleeves. The scars across her shoulders and upper arms were visible, the thin, pale patterns that had been inflicted by people who believed that marking another person was a form of ownership, that the body could be made to carry what the law couldn't hold. She had not covered them. Damien appeared in the doorway behind her. He was in the process of adjusting his own jacket, and he stopped when he saw her reflection, and his eyes moved. To her face first, then to the scars, then back to her face. She looked at his reflection. "They're going to ask about them," she said. "Tonight." "I know," he said. "I'm going to tell them." She looked at herself in the mirror, not with the assessment of someone seeking reassurance, but with the evaluating look of someone checking their own readiness. "Not everything. Enough." He moved into the room and stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, not touching, just present. "They don't make you damaged," he said. She looked at his reflection for a moment. "I know," she said. The words came out different than they would have 6 months ago, not as a performance of certainty or a deflection of comfort, but as a simple statement of fact about the current state of something that had cost a great deal to arrive at. She knew. Not because someone had told her enough times, or because enough time had passed, but because she had sat with the full weight of her own history in a federal building for 26 hours and answered every question about it with her voice steady and her eyes open. And when she walked out of that building on the 3rd day, she had understood that she had looked at it directly and it had not destroyed her, which was the only proof that had ever mattered. Damien reached up and rested 2 fingers briefly on her shoulder, not on the scars, on her shoulder. And she didn't flinch, which had once been something that required effort, and now simply was. "We're going to be late," she said. "We're not going to be late," he said. "You're still adjusting your jacket." "I'm done adjusting my jacket." She turned from the mirror and looked at him directly, and the look contained things that neither of them said, because they were people who had learned that the words for certain things existed, but were not always the most accurate delivery mechanism. He looked back at her with the face he showed when there was no audience and no performance required, which was a face that had gradually become something different from what it had been a year ago. Not softer exactly, but less defended, as if certain fortifications had been found to be unnecessary and quietly stood down. She picked up her bag from the chair. At the door she stopped. She turned back. "Damien." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for the right reasons, not for the wrong ones. I know the difference." He held her gaze. "I know you do," he said. She went out the door. He stood in the apartment for a moment after she left, in the evening light of a July in New York, in a small apartment in the West Village that contained very little of what his previous life had looked like, and considerably more of what he had not known to want from it. He thought about his brother, 26 years old, renting a room under a false name, trying to do the right thing alone. He thought about what it meant that he had finally done what Luca had been trying to do, that the thing his brother had started in isolation had found its completion, imperfectly and at great cost, and through channels that Luca, with his good heart and his faith in clean solutions, might not have chosen, but finished. He picked up his jacket. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Moving, noise, the particular relentless energy of 8 million lives in motion, indifferent and blazing and full of ordinary people who had no idea and no reason to know what had changed in its structure over the past 6 months, what had been pulled out of its foundation and handed to people who had spent years building a case for exactly this moment. He locked the apartment door and went down to the street. She was waiting on the sidewalk, looking up at the sky, where the last of the evening light was going out above the buildings. He came to stand beside her. For a moment they both looked up, then she looked at him. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. They walked together into the city, and the city received them the way it received everyone, without ceremony, without judgment, as part of the endless moving current of people going somewhere in the dark. The summer night closed around them, and New York continued, as it always had, as it always would, forward into whatever came next.